Yinspired is dedicated to all the grandmothers and aunties whose voices weren't heard or listened to and created for the daughters. Aloha, and welcome back to Yinspired, a podcast celebrating different perspectives in Chinese medicine and integrative medicine. I'm your host, Haunani Chong Drake. We made it. Here we are, episode 2. Today, we will be talking about Yin and Yang. I think it's really important to set a foundation as we begin this Yinspired journey together. And I don't want to assume, anything, but I really don't want to assume that you have an understanding or a background in Chinese medicine, philosophy, theory, or practice. And I also don't want to assume that what you have learned through cultural interpretations, at least here in the United States, that your understanding and definition of yin and yang is as holistic and full as it can be. Okay. I also want to be very clear that there are some people who spend their entire lives, PhDs, digging into this one topic. And so, to spend an hour, who knows how long this podcast will be, talking about yin and yang is just a foundation. Okay. So I want to be really clear. Again, like I said in the intro, if I misrepresent something or you think something could have been described in a more accurate perspective or definition, I would love to hear from you. So please head over to where Yinspired is hosted on Substack. That's substack.com. Look up Yinspired. If you're listening to this podcast, it'll be in the show notes. Send a kind email or a kind response in the comments if those are available to you. And let me know. This is not about me being right. This is about opening up a conversation and sharing information that I find to be very useful for our very chaotic times. And that's where I'm coming from. So let's get started. When I showed up to Chinese medicine school, I was jumping in totally blind, or what I thought was totally blind. And I remember the first week of school being very confused. You just jump in. There's no such thing as slowly peeling back the layers into theory and philosophy and practice. You just have to jump in. Now, for some people who maybe they had had a background in Asian philosophy or martial arts, or maybe they had more cultural influences growing up, maybe it didn't feel like Band-Aid being ripped off. I will share. I'm mixed Asian American with the most cultural influence outside of the American experience would have been my popo, my Chinese grandmother. So we grew up with a lot of Chinese influence in my life. And still, the first week of school, I was very confused because I had professors talking about yin yang, but I didn't know what they were talking about because growing up, I'd only ever heard yin yang. So I want to start this whole conversation, this long introduction, to say that if you have heard of yin yang growing up, or that's how it's pronounced, I want to let you know we're talking about the exact same thing, okay? And we'll get into this. Again, I don't speak Chinese, I don't read Chinese. I want that to be very clear. I shared that in the intro. And at the same time, I finally figured out what my professors were talking about. Yang has a certain accent on it that makes it more of like a ya sound or a ma sound, not an a sound or a hey sound, right? So instead of yin yang, the accent on it is then pronounced yin yang. And it makes a difference. If you don't speak Chinese and read Chinese, every vowel has the potential for, from what I understand, 5 different sounds, and each one of those definitions is very different. So we're talking about the same topic, okay? So that's our topic today. And now that we have that out of the way, I want to let you know that yin yang is a theory, it's a philosophy that really becomes the basis of Chinese medicine. And this is where I'm also going to insert this term, East Asian medicine. East Asian medicine is a term that you'll hear more and more in conversation online because East Asian medicine gives due respect to the other Asian countries and cultures that have developed their own medicine over hundreds and thousands of years. And what I find very fascinating is that not all of them, but many of them have developed from the origins of what we would now call Chinese medicine. And so you'll hear me interchange this term Chinese medicine, East Asian medicine quite a lot. And the East Asian medicine is what I'm giving reference to is, Korean medicine has distinct ways of practicing medicine. And yet, if we look at the history of Korean medicine, some of those lineages and practices come out of what would we now, what we now call China, right? Or Chinese medicine. Keep in mind, before we had boundaries, before we had country names, what we now call Chinese medicine was just called medicine, right? It didn't have a location name. It was just the medicinal practices that were used. And every region would have had their own unique version of medicine. And over time, not only as population spread, but as kingdoms spread, as politics spread, and things become, I'm going to use this word in quotes, unified, much to argue about there, we have more of a collective term of what that means. So again, not only Korean medicine, different lineages of Japanese medicine, you can trace that back and see their roots again back into Chinese medicine. And there's a lot of influence of Chinese medicine all over East Asia. So that's why I go back and forth between both Chinese medicine and East Asian medicine. So let's get into Yin Yang. So Yin Yang, again, like I said, is theory or philosophy that becomes one of the three major pillars or philosophies of Chinese medicine. There's also the wuxing or the five phases and also qi. And we will have to have another podcast about qi because it's just as fascinating. And same with wuxing or the five phase, sometimes known as the five element theory. Okay. But today we will be talking about Yin Yang. And Yin Yang has a really rich history in not only the medicinal perspective or paradigm within Chinese medicine, but also culturally, meaning through every aspect of culture that comes from this area we now call China. Although, history is not my forte, but I am very fascinated in the history of Chinese medicine. So please know that what we now talk about Chinese medicine is oftentimes, again, this modern interpretation of a very, very, very complex history. So when I give this lecture at William and Mary and at other different organizations, both private and public, one of the very first things I like to get is an understanding of people's or the group's current understanding or definition of yin and yang. And since I can't do that because we are in a podcast, I would like you to contemplate what you know currently about yin yang. How would you define it to someone if you were sitting in a car around a fire and someone asked you about it? Now, I would like to share with you some of the things that I hear back from students, or when I say student, it doesn't mean that they're in college. It's all different ages, all different backgrounds. Some of the most common definitions or answers that I receive. The most common is this idea of duality. This is probably the most common, that yin and yang represents duality. And then another one similar to that, but different, is someone will often say yin and yang is another way of talking about the masculine and feminine energies. Not that we're talking male, female in terms of biological sex or sex that we're born with, but yin yang in terms of a masculine or feminine energy. Another thing that will come up and people will discuss is they know that it has something to do with Asian philosophy. Okay, so those are the things that a lot of people will share. And what I love is all of those are correct answers to yin and yang. And there's so much more. And that's really what I want to share today, is that what I have found is that most people's understanding and definition of yin and yang are that it represents duality, that it represents this idea of, dark and light. And so when people use it in their everyday language, I actually hear this in podcasts outside of East Asian medicine or Chinese medicine. We'll hear them say something in reference to the good and the bad or the opposite side of a coin. Instead, they insert yin yang. So I want to really emphasize that yin yang theory goes way beyond this idea of duality. One of the things I want you to imagine in your mind right now is the symbol, and I'll put this in the show notes, an image of it, but I want you to imagine the symbol of yin yang. Many of you have seen it. It's everywhere. I mean, people get tattoos of it. It's on clothing. It's everywhere. But it's a circular image, right? And half of it's black and kind of a whether you call it an apostrophe or a comma, there's one part that's black and then the other half is white. And in the black, there's a little white dot. And in the white area, there's a little black dot, right? So that's the taijitu. That's a symbol often referred to as the Yin Yang symbol. But the taijitu is circular. And so the first thing as we look into Yin Yang theory is to look at this symbol. And even this symbol itself has taken on different variations throughout history. And you can see similar symbols outside of Asia, right? It's a concept, it's a theory that has in many different cultural practices around the globe across history. But the one that we'll be talking about today in the image that I'll share with you is probably the most one that we're more familiar with in modern times is this taijitu symbol. So that when you look at it, the first thing to know about yin yang theory is that it's round. And that matters. It's not triangular. It's not square. It's round. And why this is so important is because everything about yin yang, everything within East Asian medicine, everything about the world we live in on Earth, right? Us as humans, there is this reflective quality or this macrocosm, microcosm perspective. And it's repeatable forever. We can go into this a whole nother topic. But the circular nature of yin and yang not only reflects, right, the circular nature of planet Earth, but also represents this idea of movement, that there are no angles, there's no straight edges, that things are constantly in movement. The other thing that the circle represents is the idea of oneness or a great void or the name that has no name, the Tao, something that is whole, that is complete. And from this one is born the two. And so that circle also represents that one, right? That oneness. And from the one is birthed the two. The two is represented in this theory of yin yang. Okay. And so from the one comes two, the two, the three, and the three, the 10,000 things. That is a very quick interpretation of something you learn week one in Chinese medicine school. And it is a philosophy and a theory that even today, here I am, 20 years later, I can't believe it, but yeah, about 20 years later, I'm still chewing on, right? I'm still digesting. I'm still allowing it to reveal itself to me in its a variety of ways. So yin yang are the two. And keep in mind, these are two phases of cyclical movement. When we look at the characters of yin and yang, it's really important to consider yin and yang in how they are actually defined. So yin, right, the simplified character, the Chinese character of yin, represents or depicts the shadow side of a hill or a mountain. Yang shows or depicts the sunny side or the sunlit side of a hill or a mountain. And it's this imagery, it's this poetic nature. I call it poetry because when I see the world through symbolism, I can't help but think of it represents so much more than the word. So yin and yang represent the shadow side and the sunlit side of a hill. And based off of that, we begin to understand the nature of yin and yang and what yin and yang means. So before I go deeper into the four aspects of yin and yang, I want to take a moment here and describe yin and yang a little more in terms of the shadow side and the sunny side of the hill. When we're talking about yin as the shadow side of the hill, what we're also talking about is this idea of the shadow is darker. It has a heavier sensation to it. It's absorbing the light, really. It's darker. And the color black does that, right? So there's an inward movement, a contraction, a centrifugal energy to yin. Okay, so there's a pulling inward. That's yin energy. It's introverted. It's cold. It's drawing in on itself. So you could even see it as contraction or shrinking and descending. Something that becomes more heavy, something that's pulling in towards each other, becoming more and more of matter, begins to have more weight to it and begins to sink. So yin is this idea of drawing in. It's cold. It's heavier. Yang, the sunny side of the hill, has the opposite qualities and the opposite influence. So sunny side, the sun is exposing that side of the hill or mountain. You have this outward reflection of the light. It's expansion. It's upward. It's lifting upward. Heat rises, right? It's growth. It's outward. It's extroverted. There's warmth, right? So that's yang. So yin, when we're looking at the taijitu symbol again, it's represented in the fields that are dark or black. And then yang, when we're looking at the taijitu symbol, is represented in the lighter areas, the white areas. And that's about, this warmth, this radiating, this expansion. And so it's these interplays between yin, the contraction, the inward, the heavier, the cold, in relationship to the yang, which is outward, upward, warmth. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about yin and yang, is this relationship between these forces in nature. Okay. So again, same mountain, the one, but one side is shadowy and one side is light. But again, it's a circle. So there's two phases of cyclical movement. Everything is constantly moving. Any place you are in that circle. And it's not just a circle. I want to be clear. I'm not talking about just a circle. I'm talking about a three-dimensional sphere, like a globe or a ball. So anywhere you put a pin or your attention on that sphere, you are going to have a totally different perspective of the whole, right? And so this idea of one side of the sphere is shady and one side of the sphere is sunny is this representation, metaphoric, but also very real application to the constant cyclical movement of all of life, the different perspectives of all of life. And also it expresses that there is going to be some areas that have qualities that are more of the shadow side of a mountain. And then you'll have qualities that are more of the sunlit side of the mountain. And of course, we know as the earth rotates, as it rotates around the sun, also what side of the mountain has the shade and what side of the mountain has the sun will change. And this is same for yin yang theory. So let's get into it a little more. Okay, so besides being two phases of cyclical movement, yin yang represents the states of the density of matter. Okay, so keeping in mind, and some of this is going to sound like physics. It is. You have energy and you have matter, right? And we can see them as maybe being opposite of each other. But matter has form. We can touch it. We can see it. It's very obvious to us, and it's much more dense. And then we have energy, something that is more subtle. Sometimes we can see it. Sometimes we can't. Most of the time we can't. But energy and matter are two states of a continuum. And yin yang represents this same idea of two states of a continuum. But again, all along that continuum, you have all different stages of matter and energy. Okay, another example of this is you might see water. We have ice, which is much more of a solid form, all the way through its continuum of gas, right? And so here we have ice as matter, we have gas as energy, but really along that continuum, every time it moves further away from ice and closer to water and gas, it's transforming. It's at a different perspective of its evolution, of its cyclical movement, of the way that it's presenting itself. And so this also is an example of yin yang theory. We have matter and energy, and we have states in between. The other thing is that yin and yang have a relationship. We can try to separate them and talk about them individually, but then we lose the essence of yin and yang. Yin and yang are the two. They were birthed from the one, they are of the two, and it's really hard to understand their movement and their function when we separate them. The only way to really understand them is that yin and yang are in relationship to each other. Okay. And this is where it can get really heady. And this is where, people in academia go down the rabbit hole. Okay. So what are some of the relationships between yin and yang? Some people refer to these as the four aspects of the yin yang relationship. Let's get into them. So the first relationship is actually opposition. So when people think of yin yang being opposites or there being a duality, that's where this comes into play. Matter is different from energy, right? But like I said, they're part of a continuum. So the first aspect of this relationship is that it does represent an opposition, a different side of each coin. I don't want you to stop there. A lot of people just stop there. There's three other aspects that are really important. There's an interdependence of yin and yang, meaning they must work together. Yin can't be yin without yang. Yang can't be yang without yin. Furthermore, if you come back to the visual representation, you'll see there's a little bit of white within the black and a little bit of black within a broader field of white. That is also showing that within yin, there is yang. I should have said this earlier. In the taijitu, when you're looking at it, the white represents yang and the black part of the image represents yin. So the yin is the darker part of the image and the lighter or the white part of the image is yang. So when you're looking at it, there's an interdependent relationship where they work with each other. And even within yin, there's yang. And within yang, there's yin. And remember, this is a sphere. And that representation and that reflection of yang within yin, yin within yang, repeats over and over and over again. So even if we're looking at this image and we're looking at the yang within yin, if I were to zoom in even more to that area of yang within yin, and even within that yang space, there's yin within that yang. And then you microscope even further into that yin, and then there's yang within that yin. So that's how they're interdependent. And this is also very, very, very important in terms of real life application and understanding the theory a little more. Another aspect of this yin-yang relationship, the third one, is this idea of mutually consuming. And you'll see this in the image as well. You have this field of yin that's very broad, and within that big section of the dark area or the black area, you have a little yang. But as you move towards the left, or as you move along that circular nature, the field of yin becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. At the same time, on the other side, on the opposite side, the yang field, as yin is becoming smaller in its representation on the sphere, the yang is becoming bigger. Okay? That's mutual consuming. When yin becomes a lot, there's a lot less yang. When yang becomes a lot more, yin becomes a lot less. So there's this ebbing and flowing between the two. Then the fourth aspect of the yin-yang relationship is, again, represented in this taijitu symbol. Eventually, there will be a transformation of yin into yang and yang into yin. There's a transformation that happens. So yin doesn't stay yin forever. It will eventually turn into yang, and yang doesn't stay yang forever. It'll eventually turn into yin. Some people, they're like, wait a minute, how does this happen? And I remind you of the shadow side and the sunny side of a mountain. As the sphere rotates, as the earth rotates around the axis and around the sun itself, so there's two different rotations going on, the shadow and the light side change throughout the day. What once was shadow will turn into light, and what once was in the light will eventually turn into shadow. You can also see this in our daily rhythms of day and night. Okay, so besides seeing it in this idea of intertransformation of dark into light, from night into day, we can also see that in relationship to our world and our environment around us. The sun has always been such a pivotal part of understanding nature, the patterns of nature, the rhythms of nature, and then added that layer, humans are nature. And so we are also influenced in the same way, those same patterns of the sun rising and the sun setting. So yin and yang is not just this theory out there that you sit on an armchair and you talk about and there's no application to it. Yin yang theory describes nearly every pattern in nature that we can see external to us. And what I love even more about that, and one of my favorite parts of Chinese medicine and East Asian medicine, is that reminding us constantly that we are nature, that humans are part of nature. It's not something external to us. It reminds us that anything we learn outside of us in nature as a pattern also applies to us. So this theory of yin yang, which is understanding how the patterns and the influences of the sun rising and sunset affect nature around us, whether that's farming or migrations of animals or how plants grow or your mood, also applies directly to the human body as well. Okay. We can see these phases of cyclical movement in our seasons as well. We have some seasons that are more yin, and then we have some seasons that are more yang. We can see the idea of yin and yang as different states of density. When we think about our cycles that govern the earth, whether we're talking about a hydrology or a water cycle, how water, we learned this in biology in elementary and middle school and high school, right? You have the river, the lake, and then the sun's out, and then there's evaporation, and from evaporation turns into condensation, and that condensation turns into a cloud, and the cloud eventually rains down, creating precipitation back towards the earth, and the cycle starts all over again. Same essence, we want to call it water, but it has different densities. It's liquid, it's fluid, and then it turns into condensation. We can't really see it, but then it turns into a cloud, a little more dense, and then it gets so dense again, it turns back into water. And it just goes over and over and over again. This is symbolic. You can understand yin and yang in this way. When the water is fluid and we can touch it and it's flowing in the lakes, that's more yin nature. When it's liquid and it's fluid, it has more yin nature to it. When it's condensation in the air and we can't really see it, that's more yang. It's more movement based. Okay. Again, this is coming back to when we talked about the relationship of yin and yang, is that the first one is of opposition. They seem opposite. There seems like there's a duality, but remember, the duality isn't in that they never interact. As I shared, they're deeply connected, that they can't exist without each other. So this idea of opposition is one that just allows us to understand them in terms of relativity. The relationship is relative to each other. And we can apply this relativity and these qualities of yin and yang to different aspects of nature and our life. So space, time, seasons, sexual characteristics, temperature, weight, brightness, motion, on and on. So I'll give you an example of these. So when we're talking about space, Earth would be more yin, then heaven or the skies would be more yang. Time, from a yin yang perspective, night, or when it's darker, the shadowy side of the hill, night is more yin. Daytime, when the sun is out, is more yang. Seasons, autumn and winter, the darker, cooler, colder seasons of autumn and winter are more yin. Spring and summer, more yang. And now all of you in the Southern Hemisphere are going, but wait a minute, it's different for us. Yes, please know, this theory developed in the Northern Hemisphere. And so there are people, this is not my forte, but I have heard that there are colleagues who are looking at practice of yin and yang, the theory as it applies to the Southern Hemisphere and how those seasons are slightly different. The great thing that I love, and I actually bring this from one of my Ayurveda teachers, Dr. Suhash Kashirshagar, told me once, which is when we're talking about medicine and we're talking about paradigm, we're talking about what is capital T truth versus lowercase t truth. And one of the great aspects of medicine from a capital T truth is that if it's a capital T truth, it should be able to go anywhere on the planet, anywhere at time, and still be applicable. I still believe that to be true. And I'm just giving you an example. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, that yin would be represented as autumn and winter, colder, cooler months, and spring and summer would be yang. When we're looking at different biological sexes, in a yin-yang perspective, the female is more yin, the yang is more male. Okay, and that's where some people get the idea beyond biological sex of yin is more feminine energy and yang is more masculine energy. When we are looking at temperature, cold is more yin, hot is more yang. When we're looking at weight, heavy is yin, light is yang. Brightness, when we're looking at the concept or category of brightness, things that are dark are more yin, things that are more bright or light are more yang. Motion, things that are down or inward, more static, would be more yin in nature. Things that are up and out and very active are more yang in nature. Okay, so those are some examples. But again, I don't want you to just stop there and get locked into this idea that earth is yin and yang is heaven and that's it. No, 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 no. There's a relationship. There's this cyclical movement. There's yang within yin and there's yin within yang, and that goes on forever. And then they have to be in relationship with each other for these principles to work. Also, they transform into each other. Yin and yang are rooted in each other. They depend on each other. That's interdependent. One exists because of the other. Light cannot exist without the dark. Dark can't exist without the light. So they exist because of each other. Day comes after night, night after day, and that goes on and on forever. So within yang, there is yin. Within yin, there is yang. The idea of mutually consuming, as one grows in quantity, the other decreases. And this took me a long time. I don't know why, but it did for me to really wrap my head around. But I want you to think about our day, night cycle. As the sun is beginning to rise, it's still dark out. There's still a lot of yin. But as the sun continues to rise higher and higher and higher off the horizon, there's more yang to the day, and that yin nature of night starts to go away in equal proportions. So this is a proportion thing. At the height of the day, when the sun is at its apex, night or your midnight is its furthest time away. So now you have all this yang energy when the sun is directly above overhead. And then it just doesn't stop there, right? We continue to spin and yang begins to descend. It begins from its greatest yang aspect to decline. And as that declining of yang happens, the increase of yin begins to happen in equal proportion. So that is a great way of understanding that idea of yin and yang and this mutual consuming. But also another way of looking at this idea of mutual consuming is that, again, another physics term here, don't get scared, but it really applies here. Energy is neither created or destroyed, right? It's just constantly transforming into different forms. And this also applies here as well. So keep in mind this final aspect of the relationship, they're intertransforming. Yin and yang are constantly ebbing and flowing into each other. Same thing, day into night, night into day, life into death. Death is an ongoing thing. Although I do want to pause here and talk about that in this perspective of yin yang, and particular to Chinese medicine theory, it's the separation of yin and yang is what happens at the time of death. I'm sure I'll get a lot of comments on that, but that's what I'm just going to leave there. Okay. When we're looking at the seasons, we can really see this play out, this idea of intertransformation of yin and yang. Okay. Again, in a gradual way, just like our day and our night, our seasons have more aspects of yin to them. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, winter has the most yin, summer has the most yang. Luckily, in this beautiful cosmic web of life, we don't go just from winter to summer and back to winter. We don't just zigzag. No matter where you are on the planet, you move from your version of winter to summer through a transition season, right? There's a transition, there's a movement from winter into summer. Now that transition, depending on where you are in the planet, it might be really short transition, might happen very quick. In other areas, you have more of an equal distribution of the seasons of the four. Some call it 6 seasons, some call it 5 seasons around the planet. Depends on where you live. But are these transitional phases. And each one of those phases is a season. So winter is the most yin. As more yang begins to grow, we move into spring. And that's also reflective of the sunrise time. As more yang begins to rise and yin begins to decline, we move towards summer, where we are at the pinnacle of yang, yang of yang. It's the most yang time. And then at summertime, yin is at its least. As we move from summer into fall, again, that yang is declining and yin is starting to build up. That's autumn time. And then autumn back into winter, and the cycle goes on and on. Again, like I said, depending on where you are on the planet, sometimes these transition phases look different, right? They're not necessarily 3 months of each. And so you still apply yin and yang, but we look at it for what is present in your area. Okay. Another way of looking at this inner transformation, this mutually consuming, this interdependence of each other and their opposition, we can see this as a checks and balances of each other, right? There's a checks and balances here of yin and yang. Where this becomes really important when we start, one, applying it to our lives, but also recognize this unending movement towards harmony or balance. And I don't want to say balance in terms of like the bullseye or right at the fulcrum of a teeter-totter type of thing. Harmony is more of a dynamic process that's represented by yin and yang, that there is this movement, that there's perspective, that it's changing all the time. And so our job within nature, as part of nature, is to understand what is the energy of the current moment. Is it more yin? Is it more yang? What proportion of yin and what proportion of yang are there in relationship to each other? And understand our place in that natural rhythm. So whether you're talking about the time of day, whether you're talking about the season, we can look at it externally, but we can also apply that to our own lives. Knowing this, we can also use yin and yang in this checks and balances way to also guide us. It can be used as a map to help bring us more into harmony. If we notice that, so for example, hot can be counterbalanced by cold, right? That would be an interplay of hot is yang is counterbalanced by yin, cold. At the same time, hot can transform into cold, right? And vice versa. We could say the same about cold. Wet can counterbalance dry. And at the same time, wet can transform into dryness. Right? I know you're like, what? Okay, I'm just going to plant that seed. But this is how yin yang theory can be used in our lives when we begin looking at our body, when we begin to look at aging and how our bodies age across time, the changes in our body at different seasons, our body at different times of the day. These are all important. So it's this theory, it's these different cogs of the wheel, each of these spheres turning at different rates. And where is our place in all of that? To me, this is what gets so exciting. I love it. It's systems thinking, it's theory, it's philosophy, but it's also very practical wisdom. It's ecology, all bound up into theory, into yin yang theory. So another thing I want to share, people get really fascinated about this. We can look at the body, the actual human body, in terms of yin and yang. I can post this slide on the show notes as well. But yin parts of the body we would consider to be the front or the ventral side. Yang part of the body would be our back or our dorsal side. And remember, these are in relationship to each other. Below the waist is yin. Above the waist is yang. More medial, so more to the midline of your body, would be yin. Lateral, moving away from that midline, would be yang. More interior, when we're talking about going deep into the body, like past the skin and towards our organs, that would be interior. That would be more yin. As we move away from the interior towards the external, towards the skin, that would be more yang. We have anything that's inferior or below, not inferior in terms of hierarchy, but inferior in terms of a medical terminology, meaning downward. That would be more yin. Anything superior or upward, again, not in terms of hierarchy, just a direction of upward, would be more yang. Structure, anything having to do with structure, an actual tissue that we can feel and touch, where matter is coming together to create something very tangible, is more yin. Anything that is more subtle, a function, physiology, a bioenergy field, or an energy of our body, that would be more yang. If we look at it in terms of relativity towards each other, the body, the shoulder, the legs, the knees would be more yin in relationship to the head, which would be more yang. So that's just an example of how you can also apply yin and yang to the body. And knowing that, right, we begin to understand these different ideas, the shadow side of the mountain, the light side of the mountain, how that plays out in terms of temperament, it plays out in terms of physiology, how it plays out in terms of how we look at the body from both a health and what is already there. And also when things go out of balance or out of harmony, we can look at this yin-yang balance to see maybe there's too much yin somewhere, maybe there's too much yang, maybe they're not communicating with each other, they've lost their relationship. A big part of practice in Chinese medicine, whether it's through herbology or acupuncture or herbs or qigong or breath or meditation, through the martial practices, the martial arts, is to bring back this relationship between yin and yang. It's reflected all through nature, and we are nature. So there's a lot of application to our lives. There's something also very metaphoric about it, where I can essentially look at any situation, whether it's an argument or a festival or an interaction with someone, through the lens of yin and yang. And it really helps me to take judgment out of it and just see it for what it is in terms of the energies at play. So that's very useful in my life. The other thing, and this is where it becomes very useful as a clinician or working with people's bodies. So any of you who work with people's bodies, is to begin to use yin and yang as a language. I call it nature's language, or the language of yin and yang. And this, again, remember, is relative and perspective based, and it's based off of qualities. Okay, so qualities are descriptors. They describe things. And these are not definite labels. These are not diagnoses. The language of yin and yang, the nature's language, is that of quality. And if we can begin to see the world through this nature-based language, the language of yin and yang, it can actually help us move beyond labels that often come with stigmas or preconceived notions or duality of right or wrong or better than and worse than, and simply begin to see it for what it is. So let me give you an example. And I want to share that this really came together when I was in Chinese medicine school. I was in one master's program and then decided, because I have this deep, deep love for Ayurveda, and there was finally a certified Ayurveda program happening in San Diego, I decided, yes, I can do both. Well, little did I know that that was the beginning of a second master's degree. So here I am, doing 2 master's degrees at the same time, one in Chinese medicine, the other in Ayurveda. Again, don't recommend it, but at the time I was all game and, I was all in, and that totally worked for me somehow. And it was my background and understanding of Yin Yang theory, and then learning about gunas and the Gurvadi gunas within Ayurveda, where the two worlds just collided. I was like, these are saying the exact same thing. This is so exciting. I get it now. It just exploded in terms of my understanding and its usefulness and how I saw the world, like truly paradigm shifting. So I want to share that for those of you who are like, oh, this sounds familiar. And again, it's not just in East Asian medicine. It's not just in Ayurveda. There's so many cultural practices that have similar concepts of yin yang. They might call it something else. And for those of you listening, if you come from one of those cultural practices, please share. You let me know what is this yin yang theory equivalent to in your own language, in your own practice. I'd love to hear from you. So the language of yin yang is looking at these qualities of opposition, but in a way that help us describe what is currently in the present moment, whether that's a situation, whether it's a disease, whether it's an ailment, your tea, you can use this anywhere in life. And so we have our qualities that are more yin in relationship to yang. So qualities are cold, are yin, hot, or yang. Heavy is yin, light is yang. Wet is yin, dry is yang. Okay, so some of these I've already said. So let me choose some new ones. Smooth is going to be considered more yin. Rough is going to be more yang. Dense or viscous is more yin. Flowing is more yang. Soft is yin. Hard is yang. Dull is yin. Sharp is yang. Gross in terms of not like ew, gross, but gross in terms of like heaviness, of tangibility, of weight, right? Gross is more yin. Subtle is more yang. Cloudy is yin. Clear is yang. Water, yin. Fire, yang. Stillness, yin. Movement, yang. Slow, yin. Fast, yang. I actually have this on a blog. So for those of you who are visual, you can see these. I think these are so useful. I have a list of these qualities printed out on the clipboard that I use in the clinic. And when I'm working with someone, they keep using labels in the way that they're describing things. For example, I have a migraine. I say, okay, describe your migraine. And they go, well, it's a migraine. And I say, okay, well, everyone's migraine shows a little differently. I'm trying to get to the nature and how migraines show up in your body. And they just look at me with kind of deer in the headlights. I have no idea what you're saying. I will often, I'll flip to this page and I say, looking at these words, can you describe your migraine in terms of these qualities or characteristics? And oftentimes they'll be like, oh, it's heavy and it's strong and it's intense. And I'll say, okay, great. And, and then we'll get into location, but it gets their brain working in a different way outside of these diagnostic labels. And as a practitioner, what's amazing about that, especially if you've practiced or if you have a background in yin yang or understanding qualities, is that we know in order to bring harmony, what we do is we begin to introduce the opposite quality. So if everything is yin and there tends to be more yin qualities, that can help us understand this pattern that the person is in more yin, or they might have more yin present. How do we start to bring in more yang? I'm not going to get into, pattern diagnosis and prescription and all the things, but this is a very, very practical way of, one, how we can use it clinically, but also how we can connect with our clients and our patients in a way that's outside of the labels, that's outside of medical terminology, and back to qualities that we begin to learn all the way back, from the time of being a toddler in infancy. And it can create connection. It can create a shared understanding. So it becomes a very useful tool. Also, what I have found, and I use this all the time, this is essentially how I speak with my clients and patients, and I also begin to encourage them to use this language as well, is I hear patients say all the time, wow, I've never seen it that way. Of all the clinical visits I've had, of all the diagnoses I've had, of all the tests I've gone through, I've never seen it as, and they use their qualities that they said. And what usually happens after that is, not only have I not thought about it this way, there enters the space into the room where it becomes lighter. They take a deeper breath. And I will often hear after that, wow, okay, we can do this. It brings in hope. I mean, they might not use the term hope, but generally after they have this light bulb moment of, wow, I've never seen it or thought about it this way, there's this relaxation that happens. And I can see it in their eyes. I can see it in their expression. I can see it in the color of their shen or their spirit of like, wow, okay, this is not as intimidating as I thought. Because medical terminology can be incredibly intimidating. It's a whole different language onto itself. And I know that what I'm sharing with you today is also a language onto itself, right? Yin Yang, that's not our everyday language, although it is used colloquially everywhere. Or I don't know everywhere, but at least in the United States. So now we have a broader understanding of what Yin Yang actually means, where it comes from, definition, how we can apply it into our lives personally, how we can begin interacting with it, not only in nature, but also in our own lives, and also how we can use it clinically. So I would love to hear from you. How does your relationship with life change when you take away our labels, right? These diagnoses or these labels that can often come with a lot of stigma and perspective, and we begin to see the world through these qualities, through nature's language of yin and yang. I'd love to hear from you. You can head on over to where I host Yinspired podcast Substack. And if you would like to continue this conversation, share with me how your perspective may have changed, how this podcast landed for you. I would love for you to reach out to me. You can also, over there at Substack, read the transcript of today's show, find all the resources and links and images I said I'd put on the show notes. So head over to Substack.com and look for Yinspired. It's free to join. And then you will also be emailed with every new episode when it's released, along with the ability to comment and continue these conversations there. Please share this podcast with someone you know or love and help us make positive ripples in our communities all over the world. From my heart to yours, create a day you love. This podcast is for entertainment, education, and inspirational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast is direct medical advice or diagnosis and does not establish a practitioner-patient relationship. Seek care from a highly trained medical provider for your healthcare concerns.